thanks for joining us. My name is Kate Deneen, and I'm the Assistant Director at the Alliance to Protect Nantucket Sound, which is an environmental nonprofit organization dedicated to stopping the Cape Wind Project and preserving Nantucket Sound. I'd like to welcome Audra Parker. She is the COO and Executive Director of the Alliance. Welcome, Audra.
Thanks, Katie.
And Audra's here basically to provide us an update of where the Cape Wind Project stands and where we are in the battle to protect Nantucket Sound. So let's just start with the basics. What is the Cape Wind Project?
Well, for those of you who don't know what the Cape Wind Project is, it's a proposal that's been underway for almost 8 years now, and it consists of 130 turbines, each of which are 440 feet tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty, far taller than the bridges coming onto the Cape. Also, an electrical service platform. We have a picture of that.
Okay.
That, perhaps we can look at later. That would hold 40,000 gallons of transformer oil. But it's basically a massive industrial project planned for the center of Nantucket Sound in a very conflicted location.
Okay, and about how large is this project so we can kind of conceptualize it in our head?
It's a good question. It's 25 square miles, so just about the size of the island of Manhattan.
Wow, okay, and that's about less than 5 miles off our beaches?
Yep, very close to our beaches, highly visible from shore.
Okay, and so you mentioned that, we've been familiar with the Cape Wind Project for nearly 8 years now. Is Cape Wind a done deal?
No, not at all. There's a number of obstacles in the way of this project moving forward, and essentially it's because it is such a conflicted location. We've had the commercial fishermen who are opposed to the project because it would displace commercial fishermen, and the Coast Guard even telling commercial fishermen they can go fish someplace else, which is a problem since Horseshoe Shoal is one of the most lucrative and productive fishing grounds in Nantucket Sound. We have the tribes, the Wampanoag of Mashpee and the Wampanoag tribe of Gay-Hedequin on Martha's Vineyard, that are opposed to the project because it would desecrate sacred lands and it would impact their traditional religious and ceremonial practices. So they're very up in arms about the potential impacts of the project in this particular site. You've got the chambers and the towns that are concerned about impacts on tourism, impacts on recreation, because Nantucket Sound is really the heart and soul of the Cape and Islands. And this industrial project is very inconsistent with the natural beauty and the fact that Nantucket Sound is such a national treasure. There's a number of environmental impacts, impacts on birds, impacts on fisheries that I mentioned, and then of course the economic impacts. To generate wind or to generate power from an offshore wind facility is twice the cost of land-based, and it's just extremely expensive. So again, after 8 long years, we still don't know how would this affect electric rates on the Cape and Islands, and even as far as consumers in New England, since this power would be fed into the New England grid. Okay,
so some of I think the misconceptions out there about the Cape Wind Project, you've touched upon a few of them. So, I've heard people saying Cape Wind, if it were to be constructed, would lower our electric bills.
No, it's
that true?
Totally false. I mean, Cape Wind is, north of $1 billion they've been saying to construct it, maybe even $2 billion. And while, wind or the sort of fuel equivalent is free, the cost of harnessing that wind in an offshore environment is very expensive. The capital cost to build this massive project and then to operate and maintain it in a harsh marine environment is very expensive. So that translates to subsidies, tax credits, borne by Massachusetts and federal taxpayers, as well as questionable how much will this affect our electric rates, because the cost has to be borne somewhere. So the idea that wind is free, translating into that's low-cost power, is patently false.
So not only are we unsure of how this project would be financed at this point, but from what we know of Cape Wind, it could raise our electric bills, and it would be receiving both state and federal subsidies. So this is our tax dollars are potentially going to a project that would actually raise our electric bills.
And on top of that, it's got all the detriments to the Cape and Islands.
So that's a real definition of the word costly in many different
costly
ways.
In many ways, exactly. And one of the other things that I didn't mention are the public safety concerns. Both ferry operators, which transport about 3 million passengers per year over Nantucket Sound, are opposed to the project, even going as far as to call it an accident waiting to happen. The footprint is so close to navigation lanes and shipping channels, plus the spinning blades cause radar interference to marine radar. So it's really a very inappropriate location to be basically smack dab in the middle of a triangle of routes that go between, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, and the Cape.
Right.
And the radar interference issue doesn't end there. It also has huge implications for air traffic control.
Okay.
Interestingly, in the beginning of the project, the FAA, which is looking at how is this an obstruction, how would this affect air traffic, originally said it was no hazard. But then the local airports, pilots associations, towns, the Alliance, and others basically voiced their concerns about safety and documented some of the issues that were going on internationally and nationally in terms of other projects being canceled because of radar interference. And in the UK, a lot of studies coming out on, radar interference is an issue for missile defense, it's an issue for marine radar, and it's an issue for air traffic control. So subsequent to that, the FAA did a closer evaluation, came out, did site visits with the airports, and now have issued what's called a presumed hazard determination, because they have said, yes, radar interference is a very real issue. We need to study this more to see what kind of impacts that would have. Is it a hazard to air safety? And at this point, they've called it a presumed hazard.
So I think that's encouraging in several ways for our viewers, listening, who might feel like this is kind of out of their hands. How can we influence the outcome of this? But you mentioned the 3 airports really got involved here and worked with the FAA to say, hey, I think you're really missing some dangers here.
Right.
So it's a lot of this revisiting of the radar issue is due to public input,
No,
right?
It's definitely important to be vigilant, to raise all the issues, to write letters and to understand this is not a done deal. There's lawsuits underway today by the Alliance, by Cape Cod Commission, by residents, by the town of Barnstable. Cape Wind has to have each and every one of about 20 some odd permits. Some of them have been grouped into a composite permit, which we can get into, but they need each and every one of those. And so every time the media says, Cape Wind received a permit, people obviously don't understand that there's so many permits that they have to get, that it's not a done deal. There's still a long way to go, and there's substantial issues like that of public safety. And yes, renewable energy is great, but it has to be the appropriate location. And if we're risking lives and risking public safety, clearly, Nantucket Sound is not the right location.
Right. So, like you said, it only takes one permit denial to stop Cape Wind and protect Nantucket Sound and help us find responsible locations for renewable energy projects.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so one permit, so out of about 20.
That's right.
Okay.
And what I was alluding to before was the Cape Cod Commission, which is a regulatory land use agency here that's basically trying to limit inappropriate development, denied Cape Wind on procedural grounds, I guess over a year ago.
Yeah.
And subsequent to that, Cape Wind filed an appeal with the EFSB, which is the State Energy Facility Siting Board, and they get involved in permitting energy projects. So basically there was a decision by EFSB to overturn the Cape Cod Commission's decision. But not only that, Cape Wind applied for a so-called super permit or composite permit that lumped together 9 separate state and local permits, including those from the town of Barnstable and the town of Yarmouth. So EFSB basically said to Cape Wind, yep, you don't have to go through this permitting process for, through the towns, through the other state agencies. We're going to issue this one composite permit, and we're going to overturn what Cape Cod Commission said already. So now what's happening is Cape Cod Commission, Town of Barnstable, and the Alliance to Protect Nantucket Sound have all filed an appeal, and the appeal now goes to the State Supreme Judicial Court, which is obviously the highest court in the state, to basically overturn that decision. And it's got not only implications for Cape Wind, but this decision, if it's not overturned, has set a very dangerous precedent, because it's basically saying, who cares what a local community says? Who cares what Cape Cod Commission says when it comes to any kind of power generation or any kind of energy project? The EFSB, or the State Energy Facility Siting Board, can overturn that. So it's very important for people to understand that, especially as now we have a state ocean planning process in place, which Senator O'Leary had put forth and had passed last year. And the good part is the idea is good, where we're basically saying we don't have any kind of zoning approach to our oceans, so we really need to put in place some kind of planning process that says, how do we use our oceans, what's appropriate, what areas are appropriate for development, what areas should be inappropriate, and it kind of started a planning process. The bad part of that, from our perspective, is there was something called the Massachusetts Ocean Sanctuaries Act. And that basically said state waters, which go out from land out to 3 miles. And in the case of Nantucket Sound, it's basically totally surrounds kind of a hole in the donut, which is federal waters where Cape Wind's being proposed. But you've got state waters totally encircling that.
And that's a very unique situation, right?
It's the only one in the continental U.S. that's like that, where you have state ocean sanctuaries surrounding that. But previously, the State Ocean Sanctuaries Act, or the MOSA, had precluded any kind of electrical generation, including renewable energy projects in state waters. This was considered a sanctuary. And that bill or that legislation, in addition to putting forth the kind of zoning planning process, which is great, weakened those prohibitions and basically now allows what they're calling appropriately scaled renewable energy
development. Which we don't know what that means yet.
We don't know what that means or where those are allowed. So that, together with this EFSB decision, basically creates a very difficult situation where if it's not overturned, you're going to have communities not just on the Cape and Islands, but throughout Massachusetts that are going to have very little say over what's happening in their local communities, because you're going to have centralized, potentially centralized control or centralized decision making, totally subverting, home rule or any kind of home control. So it's something that, affects Cape Cod and the islands, but also affects Massachusetts statewide.
Right, so this issue of violating local home rule and local jurisdiction really transcends just the Cape Wind project.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. It's going to affect any any place that basically has an offshore environment, and if the municipality isn't supporting the project for some particular reason, whether it's interference with local fishing, interference with public safety, economic reasons, environmental reasons, they're going to have very little say in that, because essentially the EFSB would be able to come in and say, no, we can basically overturn what you in your community want or think is appropriate.
So this is an issue that ultimately could impact a lot more than just Nantucket Sound. Yes. So I think it's something that is important that a lot of people understand. It's not just about the Cape Wind project.
And I think there's 13 of these kind of land use commissions, Cape Cod Commission, Martha's Vineyard Commission, a number of other ones. I believe that Cape Cod Commission and Martha's Vineyard Commission are the only ones that have regulatory authority, but there are other commissions that would be involved statewide, and they're basically trying to protect communities from inappropriate development. So again, renewable energy is fine, but because you require such a large footprint to generate a fairly small amount of power, as you pointed out, 25 square miles for Cape Wind to generate a fairly small amount of power, 1% of New England's needs, siting becomes a huge issue. And local communities should have a say in whether or not it's appropriate or not, because of conflicts, as we have many in Nantucket Sound.
So, but the good news is, as you mentioned, that we have 3 separate appeals in the works right now.
That's right.
So this, this is being challenged, and I think that the Alliance had previously mentioned, some optimism about these appeals, because the appeal process is now in a court for the first time.
An objective venue, exactly.
Right.
And there's a few other court cases underway also. The Office of Coastal Zone Management had issued what's called a consistency determination, and there's a number of reasons why they're in violation of their own policies, which are intended to protect coastal resources.
Right.
So there's a suit underway against Massachusetts Coastal Zone Management, also one against the Department of Environmental Protection, and one against the state for a certificate that was filed in '07.
So there's a lot.
There's a lot of lawsuits. There's a lot of activity. It's the Alliance, it's residents, it's Barnstable, it's Cape Cod Commission. So there's a number of lawsuits at the state level. And again, state and local is one part. There's the whole federal jurisdiction, the whole federal review process, which is still ongoing as well. So
those lawsuits that you mentioned on the state level really speak to the breadth and organization of the local opposition to the Cape Wind project. So, it's not just miscellaneous objections, but it's the Cape Cod Commission, the towns, the Alliance, taxpayer organizations, really united in targeting their approach, how to best
and I think
appeal.
The key issue is that this issue is always portrayed in the media as NIMBY. It's just a bunch of select few wealthy waterfront homeowners. It's really not that at all. It spans all demographics. It's obviously towns, chambers, fishermen that earn their livelihoods there, tribes whose ceremonial and religious practices will be affected. Boating groups. I mean, it really spans a variety of stakeholder interests, and I would say, the majority of stakeholders or users of Nantucket Sound are opposed to this project. And, the proponents of Cape Wind like to paint this wide statewide support for this project. And again, the people that are going to experience the downsides of this project are the stakeholders, the ones that live closest to the proposed project, and that's really where opposition is deep and widespread.
Yeah, okay. So you mentioned the state issues. Can you talk a little bit about where we are in the federal review process?
Yep. Back in 2005, or when the project first got proposed in 2001, I believe, there was really no process in place for how do you permit renewable energy uses on the outer continental shelf or federal waters.
And that is, and we who live by Nantucket Sound, we don't think of Nantucket Sound as the outer continental shelf. You think it's way out there, but Nantucket Sound is the outer continental shelf, right?
It is.
Okay.
And that's exactly right. And that's why if you look at alternative sites, every other place is land and then ocean with no destinations on the other side versus you've got the Cape and then you've got the two islands. So you really have this triangular pattern. It's more like
it's almost a landlocked area.
It is. Yeah. It's like a lake more than, or it's a sound.
Exactly,
an open ocean. Anyways, so in 2005, there was an Energy Policy Act passed, and what had happened was the Army Corps of Engineers was sort of the default federal agency that had been reviewing Cape Wind and another project at the time, which was the Long Island Power Authority project, which has since been canceled because of the cost and stakeholders and locals going crazy basically over the cost that they would have to bear for this project.
And when you say cost, that's personal cost, higher electric bills, subsidies, the same things we're talking about here.
Exactly, the cost of the power. And the fact that in order to make it make sense that they would have to be higher costs borne by the consumers. Anyway, so that project was canceled. So the Department of Interior, with that passing of the Energy Policy Act, got the authority to not only permit Cape Wind and the LIPA project, which was in the pipeline at that point, as well as to put forth regulations on how in general do you review and permit and lease renewable energy projects on the outer continental shelf.
Okay.
So in fact today, it's a momentous day I guess, because those regulations are actually becoming effective. So 4 years after the fact, we finally have regulations in place. We are hopeful that those regulations will in fact be applied to Cape Wind, but that's not entirely clear. Additionally, the Obama administration in early June announced a national policy for zoning our oceans and coasts. So similar to what the state is doing. Nationwide, they're trying to look at a comprehensive policy for all types of power projects, all types of uses for federal waters, and instead of taking kind of a piecemeal, fragmented approach, a developer like Cape Wind says, I want to use this piece of water, and going forward there, it's really taking a comprehensive look and saying, what areas are appropriate for development and what areas, like Nantucket Sound, should be off limits
Makes sense,
to
right?
development. Exactly. So kind of a zoning approach, and we're hopeful that Cape Wind would be subject to the regulations as well as the national policy. That being said, Cape Wind has been proceeding through the federal review, which Department of Interior designated to MMS, which is the Mineral Management Service. They came out with a draft environmental impact statement, and then last year a final environmental impact statement, which, while was largely favorable to Cape Wind, did document some areas of concern. And we spent a great deal of time with experts ranging from avian experts, benthic experts, air safety experts, documenting the many problems. For example, they had come out in the final statement and said the impacts to aviation will be minimal to negligible. At the same time, the FAA came out with the presumed hazard determination. So, huge red flags, huge issues in that. So the next step is that MMS would come out with what they call a ROD, or record of decision.
Okay.
However, before doing that, there's a number of issues that still are outstanding. One is, how would Cape Wind comply with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which basically prohibits any kind of unauthorized take of migratory birds. Another big
and that final environmental impact study you mentioned, that confirmed that endangered species would be affected by the project?
There was some issues on exactly the avian impacts of endangered species as well as migratory
birds. Because we have the piping plover and the roseate tern in Nantucket Sound, and a take, as they call it, would be a kill of an endangered bird.
Exactly, and an unauthorized take of any kind of migratory birds, and it's not clear how MMS will enforce compliance with that. But another really key issue is they have to go through something called the Section 106 consultation process, and that's basically consulting with the local tribes and consulting with the historic agencies to understand what the impacts are. And in fact, MMS itself has already documented that there would be adverse impacts to numerous historic sites as well as to tribal sites. And what they said on the tribal site issue, they said the only effective mitigation to the impacts on tribal, ceremonial, and religious practices is relocation. So
that's a really powerful statement.
Really pushes and confirms what we've been saying all along, which is renewable energy is great. We can say yes to wind, but no to Cape Wind. Nantucket Sound is, the absolutely wrong location because of all the issues we've mentioned, and now you've got, the tribal and historic process, which is unclear how that can be resolved short of relocating, because you can't relocate the tribal properties, you can't relocate the historic properties, but you can clearly relocate Cape Wind.
Right.
And we've seen over time a number of alternatives. You've got Deepwater Wind, which is working diligently in the state of Rhode Island, doing studies, doing an assessment of where location's appropriate, and they in fact came out with most of the resource in the 12 to 15 miles from shore, not just because of the view shed and the visibility, which is an issue, but also because of impacts on fisheries, impacts on navigation, aviation, and all the other conflicts that we see with this project and any projects that are closer to shore. We have Blue H, which is a deep water project, which actually uses a different technology and is floating rather than the monopile foundations, which Cape Wind is proposing, which are essentially 18-foot diameter structures drilled 85 feet into the seabed, 130 of them. So think about how invasive that is to the seafloor, how it changes things, how it would hurt, juvenile fish, just the environmental impact.
And this is on Horseshoe Shoal, the fishing ground you mentioned before.
Exactly. So Blue H, while it still has to go through an environmental review, seems as a promising alternative because it is floating. It's a newer technology, 23 miles southwest of Martha's Vineyard, out of navigation channels, out of the fisheries, et cetera. So it really seems that it would have more promise. You've got land-based alternatives on the Mass Military Reservation, which have been recently proposed. Blue Water Wind working in Delaware. So there's clearly a number of alternative sites. So you can go forward with renewable energy projects which are supported by the communities, not opposed by the communities because of all the conflicts.
Yeah, so Cape Wind would expect us to believe that Horseshoe Shoal and Nantucket Sound is the only place for an offshore wind farm. But we have all of these other projects being proposed up and down the eastern seaboard that are completely disproving that statement.
And another thing I think they like to believe, or would like the public to believe, is that Deepwater Wind is a pipe dream. It's a far out technology, but in fact, you have floating turbines already up in Europe as pilot projects, and you have Blue H proposing their pilot for next year. And if you look at Cape Wind's technology, they've been proposing this 3.6 GE turbine
for almost 8 years now,
and that's not commercially available. That's not in production. So they're going to have to do something to swap in some other technology or some other turbine. So saying that deep water is a distant reality is just really a myth.
And some of the things that are appealing about deep water are obviously it can be sited, these projects can be sited in less conflicted locations, but also you mentioned that there's a greater resource here, so there are stronger, more consistent winds.
That's right.
So that translates to more efficiency.
Right. So for the same footprint, you can generate a lot more power, and you're not as constrained even by size. You could have economies of scale and scale these things up if you were in distant waters. And again, each site needs to be evaluated, needs to go through an environmental process. But at first glance, it seems that you have stronger winds, less invasive technology, and less conflicts with navigation, fisheries, clearly with historic impacts, tribal impacts. So it seems like a win-win situation. So why are we sitting here 8 years down the road still talking about this project, which is very conflicted, when there clearly are win-win solutions?
And you mentioned projects down in Delaware. Projects that are potentially not generating as much controversy and debate as the Cape Wind project, proving that a wind project doesn't have to be so difficult and so conflicted, and that a developer could work with the communities to find an appropriate location. It doesn't have to be such a long, arduous, divisive process.
And it doesn't have to be at the expense of the stakeholders. Again, the fishermen that earn their livings there, and it doesn't have to show really such a disrespect to the community. If you even think about, Cape Cod Commission, which represents this community in terms of controlling inappropriate development, and Cape Wind basically saying, we don't really care what you say, we're going to go appeal this to EFSB. That's not working with the community. That's not being, a good neighbor.
Now, I just wanted to touch upon another thing you had mentioned. You brought up this Section 106 consultation process, which is loosely, the government, our federal government, consulting with the tribes. Can you just go over very briefly some of the tribes' specific issues with the Cape Wind project? You mentioned some sacred sites. And
Sure. I mean, to start with, the Horseshoe Shoal, the belief is that it was once dry land, and the Aquinnah, Wampanoag, and Martha's Vineyard have said in some of their comments to the federal agencies that they hunted, they fished there, they even buried their ancestors there.
Okay.
So it's considered, very sacred ancestral lands. On top of that, Wampanoag means people of the first light. So both the Mashpee tribe and the Martha's Vineyard tribe are both called the Wampanoag people. As people of the first light, an unobstructed viewshed of the sun over Nantucket Sound is integral to their religious and ceremonial practices. So clearly Cape Wind, there's 25 square mile, 40-story structures would have huge significance to them from both a religious and cultural standpoint, and essentially desecrate their sacred lands. These are people that have lived here for generations. A lot of them are fishermen that earn their livelihoods in Horseshoe Shoal. So this clearly has huge implications for them, and they are protected under various acts. So this is, this is something that the feds need to address and need to take very seriously. And again, they themselves have acknowledged that relocation really is the only effective mitigation. So we've been proposing, a broader set of alternatives and really pushing on some of the alternatives that they've looked at, but to broaden it, since there have been so many other alternatives that have come forth since the project was first proposed, and as technology, in fact, has advanced since 2001.
Right, of course. Well, I think that really puts the project in perspective for a lot of people, and the idea of relocation and alternative technologies and locations is very promising for our viewers watching today who want to protect Nantucket Sound, but also want to pursue renewable energy. So to wrap it up here, for our viewers who are watching today, what can they do this summer to help save our sound?
Well, first thing is that we totally rely on private funding, so donations are always appreciated. You can go to saveoursound.org and donate. You can call our office at 508-775-9767, donate. You can call us up and ask any questions. We're happy to talk to you and give you more more detail. We have newsletters. We'd be happy if you took those and distributed them within your local community. Most storefronts are eager and happy to have them to educate people. If you'd like to host an event, whether it's a fundraiser and just an information session, that'd be great. And just writing letters to the editor, writing to your local newspaper, whether it's the Cape Cod Times, the Martha's Vineyard papers, the Nantucket papers, or even Boston papers, and just letting people know your concerns, why we can say yes to wind but no to Cape Wind, that there are a lot of other alternatives, and this isn't the end-all be-all, and in fact it's a very conflicted location.
And if you oppose Cape Wind, you're in very good company, as you mentioned.
You are. You can also get bumper stickers, Save Our Sound bumper stickers. We have Nantucket Sound, not for sale signs.
The yard signs you see in people's yards,
which we're happy to give you and happy to have you display. And I think that's really great, especially in the summer months, where you have a lot of the summer community that may not have been following as closely what has happened over the year, or only seeing the little media snippets, which are fairly misleading in some ways. To really educate people, talk to your neighbors, put up the signs, write letters, and just really communicate on why Cape Wind is not a done deal and why it's really a bad location for this project.
Great. Well, I think from all of the topics we've touched upon today, it's clear that Cape Wind is not a done deal, as you mentioned. And if all our viewers watching today can go to saveoursound.org to educate themselves, educate their friends and family, and but please act today, because as you mentioned, once Nantucket Sound is gone, it's gone forever. So thank you so much, Audra. Thanks for all tuning in, and please stay engaged this summer. Thank you.